Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
It's funny, in a twisted kind of way, how memory works when you're the one always sitting at the edge of the frame, just outside the glow of family photos and inside jokes, never quite forgotten, but never fully seen either. Like furniture that's always been there so nobody bothers to look at it anymore. That night after I switched the teacups, after I sat there in silence, watching them sip and laugh and plan for a trip I wasn't invited to, I didn't feel triumphant or even satisfied. I just felt still. As though some storm had finally passed, but left a silence so heavy I couldn't quite breathe through it yet. I found myself watching them more closely than ever, my eyes flicking between Emily's animated gestures as she described a pastry tour in Montmartre and my mother's proud, beaming face, eyes soft, cheeks flushed, that warmth she only ever saved for the daughter who, somehow, could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. It wasn't just about the birthday anymore. That was just the tip of the iceberg that finally broke loose. What haunted me most in that moment, what made me sit upright long after they had gone to bed, was this suffocating realization that everything I had accepted for decades, every shrug, every "you're overreacting," every passive-aggressive comment disguised as motherly advice, wasn't just an accident of personality or a flaw in communication, but a pattern. A deliberate, consistent choice. I was the safe daughter, the one who didn't ask for much, who got good grades without help, who never called drunk at 3 a.m, who kept her job, paid her bills, and visited home even when no one noticed she had. And in return, I got to be the background music to someone else's starring role. As a child, I used to write down every time my mother made a promise and broke it. I don't know why, I think I hoped that someday I'd show it to her and she'd gasp, maybe even cry, apologize, realize how careless she'd been. Birthdays were the biggest category, missed recitals, forgotten school presentations, once even leaving me at soccer practice because she lost track of time, shopping for Emily's piano recital dress. I remember sitting on the bench until dark, watching the other kids get picked up, one by one, until the coach finally asked if I wanted to use the office phone. When I got home, Mom was mad at me for not reminding her. I was 11. And she was 44, the same age I'm about to be next year. The irony stings. I think the worst part isn't the absence itself, but the way it's brushed off, minimized, turned into your problem. When you try to bring it up, when you dare to say, "That hurt me," you're met with bewildered eyes and a slightly offended laugh, like you're making a mountain out of a molehill, like your pain is a character flaw. You're too serious, Lisa. Why can't you let things go? You always overthink everything. But tell me, how do you unfeel years of being invisible? How do you pretend you weren't trained, slowly and methodically, to lower your expectations until they're so low they barely register? I hadn't planned anything when I switched those mugs. It wasn't a plot or some premeditated act of vengeance. It was instinct. Like something primal had finally been stirred awake after too many years of swallowing every emotion that wasn't polite. Watching my sister sip from the cup meant for me wasn't about punishing her, it was about reclaiming space I'd been denied in the most intimate, personal way possible. It was a whisper in the middle of the noise, saying, "I see you. I see how you've ignored me, and I'm done pretending I don't notice." That evening, as the sky darkened and the house grew quiet, Emily stretched across the couch with her phone, scrolling through flights and influencers and Parisian restaurants with names she couldn't pronounce. My mother sat beside her, curled up like a proud spectator watching her champion prepare for glory. "We should do a spa day when you're back," she said sweetly, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. I waited. Nothing to me. Not even a glance. It was as though I had already left, like I was just another piece of furniture in the background, something expected to be there but not acknowledged. Later that night, as we all lingered in the living room pretending that the family was intact and healthy, Emily looked up from her screen and said, "I'm thinking of extending my trip by a few days." "Mom, can you feed Oliver?" Her damn dog, not a word to me. I'd watched that animal 3 times this year already, unpaid, unnoticed, while she gallivanted off to yoga retreats and weekend getaways. My mother smiled, delighted to be asked, and said, "Of course, honey, we'll take care of everything here. You just enjoy Paris. That was the moment right there, as I sat holding my tea, half warm and untouched, that it hit me with such force I nearly laughed out loud. I was never meant to be the daughter she bragged about. I was the one she leaned on quietly, the one who filled in the gaps, who made sure everything kept moving while Emily got to shine. I was the fallback plan, the spare. And I think, somewhere along the way, I internalized that so deeply that I stopped even questioning it. Until now. I excused myself not long after, pretending to be tired, though I wasn't. I just needed air, silence, space, something that wasn't soaked in pretense. In the bathroom mirror, I studied my face, noting how different I looked when I wasn't smiling for their benefit. I looked older. Wiser, maybe. Worn down, definitely. But there was something else in my reflection that hadn't been there before, a kind of sharpness around the eyes, like I'd finally seen something I could never unsee. When I returned to the kitchen to clean up, I noticed the mug still sitting on the counter. Emily's was nearly empty, a faint smear of honey sticking to the inside. I rinsed it slowly, watching the swirl disappear down the drain, and in that moment I made a choice, not to be cruel, not to harm anyone, but to finally, fully stop playing along. I wouldn't beg for affection. I wouldn't remind anyone of what they forgot. I wouldn't carry their guilt anymore, hoping it would someday turn into love. Because the truth is, people rarely change. But you can. You can decide that being invisible isn't noble. That being quiet doesn't mean you have to be silent forever. You can reclaim your story, one silent act at a time. One switch of a teacup. One withheld apology. One step away from a table that was never really set for you in the first place. And I wasn't done yet. No, this was just the beginning. The silence that settled over the room after Emily took the first sip of her tea was almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been paying attention the way I had been. Anyone who wasn't listening with the kind of finely tuned awareness that comes from years of being spoken over, dismissed, and made to feel like an afterthought in your own home, because to them, it was just another evening of shared tea and pleasant conversation. But to me, it was something else entirely, something electric. Something that buzzed beneath the surface like a hidden current finally coming to life after decades of being buried under polite smiles and well-timed laughter that never quite reached my eyes. Emily held the cup with both hands, the way she always did when she wanted to appear delicate, graceful, almost ethereal, like she was performing for an invisible audience that only existed in her mind, and maybe in Mom's eyes too. Because Mom always saw her as something rare and special, something to be protected and admired, not like me, who was expected to endure, to handle things, to stay calm and make the hard choices without complaint. I watched as Emily took that second sip, this one deeper than the first, and I noticed the way her lips curled slightly afterward, not into a smile, but into that familiar self-satisfied smirk she wore whenever she felt just a little more adored than everyone else in the room. And for a moment, I felt nothing. Not guilt, not anxiety, not even anticipation, just a strange, hollow stillness, like standing at the edge of a long tunnel and realizing that the echo you've been chasing all your life was never your voice coming back to you, but just empty air bouncing off walls that never cared about what you were shouting in the first place. Then she coughed. It started small, barely noticeable, just a quick clearing of the throat that could have meant nothing at all. But then came a second one, sharper, more urgent, and then her eyes widened just a fraction, not enough for panic, not yet. But enough for me to see something shift in her, a flicker of confusion breaking through that shield of effortless charm she always wore like a second skin. I set my own cup down slowly, without taking a sip, and folded my hands in my lap, keeping my gaze steady as her coughing grew more persistent, more erratic, and her fingers reached instinctively for her throat. "Are you okay?" Mom asked, the concern in her voice so immediate, so maternal, that for a second it made me wonder how different things would have been if I had ever inspired that same tone from her, if she had ever looked at me with that kind of fear. That fierce, protective urgency that said, "Not my child, not on my watch." Emily gasped then, one hand clutching at her neck, the other gripping the edge of the table, and Mom was already out of her chair, knocking it backward in her rush to get to her, while I remained seated, still and composed, my face neutral. My heart beat steady in a way that surprised even me, because I thought I might feel something, anything, but all I felt was clarity, a sudden brightness in my mind that cut through the noise like a knife. I can't, Emily wheezed, her voice ragged now, broken by the shallow breaths she was trying to take, and Mom was shouting something, Emily's name, maybe, or call an ambulance, I don't remember. But all I could focus on was the way the light from the kitchen lamp cast a soft glow over Emily's face, which had gone pale and slick with sweat, the lipstick she'd carefully applied now smeared at the corners of her mouth, and I thought about how fragile she looked. How suddenly human, stripped of the arrogance and the confidence and the thousand tiny privileges she never even noticed she had. But I wasn't afraid, because I knew what was in the tea. I knew exactly what I had done and, more importantly, what I hadn't done. There was no poison, no harmful chemical, no irreversible substance. What I had added was a little crushed vitamin C tablet, harmless in itself, and just enough lemon extract to mimic the scent of kiwi, which Emily had claimed, for years, to be allergic to. Not because she actually was God, no, but because it had gotten her out of school lunches she didn't like, because it made people hover around her with concern, because it gave her a story to tell at dinner parties about that time I nearly died from a fruit salad. I had called her bluff. And for the first time in my life, I saw what it looked like when her performance met reality and couldn't keep up. Mom was panicking now, calling Emily's name, shouting for her inhaler, though she didn't have asthma, and rummaging through her purse with shaking hands while Emily panted and coughed and looked at me with this wild, pleading expression that should have made me feel something more than mild curiosity, but didn't, because deep down I think she knew in that moment that this wasn't an accident. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. But she knew that something had shifted, that the sister she always dismissed, always underestimated, had finally stood up, not loudly, not violently, but with surgical precision. Mom finally looked at me then, eyes wide and trembling, voice shaking as she whispered, "Lisa, what the hell is happening?" And I just smiled. Not a big, cruel grin, just a small, knowing one. The kind of smile you give when someone's finally seeing you clearly for the first time, when the curtain lifts and the truth stands bare in the spotlight. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and said, "She always said she was allergic to kiwi." I guess she wasn't lying. It took another 5 minutes for Emily to settle down. Her breathing slowed. Her color returned. No ambulance needed. No hospital trip. Just enough fear to rattle the pedestal she stood on, to make her and Mom both realize that the balance had shifted, that the rules they had played by for decades, rules I never got to write, were no longer in effect. That night, after Emily went to bed early to recover, and Mom sat at the table pretending to clean up while shooting me glances she didn't know how to interpret, I felt something settle in my chest, not triumph, not vengeance, but peace. A quiet, cold peace that told me I had done something irreversible, not to them, but to myself. I had finally chosen me. I had finally stopped waiting. But this wasn't the end. Because now that they were listening, really listening, I wasn't going to stay silent. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace or resolution, but instead grows out of fear, tension, and the sudden understanding that the person sitting across from you is no longer the same individual you've quietly kept in a small, manageable box your entire life, because after what happened at that dinner table, the silence that followed between me and my mother was not the absence of conversation, but the beginning of a reckoning, the first long pause in a life where I had been expected to fill every space with patience, with acceptance, with silence of my own, always absorbing her words, her dismissals, her favoritism, until I had nothing left to absorb without losing who I was. It didn't take long for her to find me. The next morning, just after sunrise, when the house was still quiet and Emily was presumably recovering in bed from the reaction she believed had nearly taken her life, Mom appeared in the kitchen doorway with that practiced calm that had once fooled me into believing she was composed out of kindness, not control. She was holding the kettle in one hand and 2 mugs in the other, a gesture that might have looked innocent to anyone else, but to me, felt like a challenge, a test, a hesitant invitation to play the same old game. One where I was expected to forget what had happened the night before and pretend, for her sake, that nothing had changed, that we were still mother and daughter in the way that made her comfortable, which had always meant me being small enough not to threaten her balance. I didn't take the mug. I just looked at her, held her gaze, and waited for the real reason she had come into the room, because we both knew the tea was a prop, something she used to signal civility and connection, but not truth. She set the mugs down on the table, carefully, like they were fragile, like the sound of porcelain meeting could shatter the thin wall of denial she was still clinging to. Then, slowly, she sat across from me, folded her hands, and asked, "Lisa, what did you do?" There was no anger in her voice, no accusation that rose above a whisper. It wasn't the fury of a betrayed mother, but the trembling uncertainty of a woman who, for the first time, realized she might not fully understand the daughter she had raised. No, not raised, not really. Overseen, perhaps. Managed. Groomed to be useful, reliable, non-threatening. I tilted my head slightly, watching her as I answered, not with malice, but with clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from standing on the edge for too long and finally deciding to step away instead of waiting to be pushed. "I gave Emily the cup you poured for me," I said. "That's all." She blinked, twice, slowly, and I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, not out of confusion but disbelief, like the reality she had carefully constructed was beginning to crack, and she didn't yet know which piece to grab first to stop the collapse. "But why?" she asked, though I knew she knew the answer. She just needed to hear me say it, needed me to carry the responsibility of naming the betrayal, as if that would somehow soften her role in causing it. I didn't speak for a long moment, letting the question sit between us, letting her squirm in the discomfort of her own making, because for once, I wasn't going to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. When I finally did speak, my voice was steady, calm, and deliberate. "You forgot my birthday, Mom," I said, and I watched her flinch, not dramatically, just a small, involuntary twitch of the mouth, a flicker of guilt that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "You forgot it like you've forgotten so many other things that mattered to me, and then you turned around and made tea like nothing had happened. Like we were just three women enjoying each other's company instead of two daughters orbiting a mother who only has room in her heart for one." Her face hardened slightly at that, her shoulders stiffening as she sat up straighter, preparing, I imagine, to defend herself, to push back with the same tired lines about how you girls were always treated equally, or I did the best I could. But I stopped her before she could launch into the performance. "Don't," I said, quietly but firmly, and something in my tone must have reached her, because her mouth closed again and she leaned back slightly, unsure of where to go next in a conversation that wasn't playing out on her terms. "You made me the responsible one," I continued, my voice rising just slightly now, not out of anger but out of necessity, because I needed her to hear this, really hear it, without retreating behind the excuses she had leaned on for years. "You leaned on me when Dad left. You expected me to help with Emily, to understand when things were hard for you, to always be the one who didn't need attention or comfort or reminders because I was strong or mature. But the truth is, Mom, I was just quieter about how much it hurt." She swallowed hard, looking at her hands now, not because she cared about my pain. I don't think she ever really knew what it meant to care in that way, but because, for the first time, she was realizing she couldn't control this moment. Couldn't redirect it or minimize it or make me feel like I was overreacting. And then, in a voice so small I almost missed it, she said, "I didn't know it hurt you that much." That's when I laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just a short, breathless sound that escaped before I could stop it, because the absurdity of it was too much. "You didn't know," I repeated, shaking my head, "because you never asked. You never wanted to know. You assumed everything was fine because I didn't scream or cry or make a scene, but silence doesn't mean contentment, Mom. Sometimes silence is just survival." We sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, the sun creeping higher through the kitchen window as she stared at the mug in front of her like it held answers she couldn't find. Eventually, she picked it up, but didn't drink. Just held it, as if unsure whether the act of sipping would mean accepting something about me she wasn't ready to face. I reached for my water instead, letting the quiet stretch between us, a quiet I no longer felt responsible for filling. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an attempt at one. It was just a sigh, long and tired, followed by the words, "I never wanted you to feel unloved." And I nodded, not because I believed her, but because I was done trying to make her see the difference between intention and impact. "You didn't have to want it, Mom," I said. "You just had to do it." And you did. She left the kitchen a few minutes later, tea still untouched, her steps slow and unsure in a house she once moved through with absolute authority. I didn't follow her. I didn't call out. I just stayed at the table, sipping my water, feeling the weight of years start to lift, not all at once, not completely, but enough to let in something new. Space. Distance. Freedom. I had always thought confronting her would feel like a war, like fire and fury and shouting, but it didn't. It felt like turning on a light in a room where I had lived in the dark for too long. And in that light, I saw her clearly for the first time, not as the mother I had tried so hard to earn love from, but as a woman who, perhaps, was never capable of giving it equally. But even then, I knew this wasn't finished. Because Emily would be back from Paris eventually. And this time, I would be waiting. In the weeks that followed, the house returned to its usual rhythm, or at least, it tried to, because while the walls looked the same, and the furniture hadn't moved, and the air still smelled faintly of lavender and old coffee, something beneath the surface had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone, no matter how many polite conversations we forced or how carefully we danced around the thing we no longer spoke of directly. Emily had gone to Paris, as planned, posting photos of croissants and rooftop views and overpriced boutiques, her captions littered with shallow wisdom about new beginnings and leaving the past behind, while my mother, true to form, resumed her routines with a kind of shaky cheerfulness that would have fooled most people, people who didn't know what it looked like when she was pretending not to be afraid. But I wasn't most people. I had been trained, from the moment I was old enough to hold a plate without dropping it, to read her face like scripture, to interpret every slight tilt of the chin or purse of the lips as a coded message meant only for me, warnings, permissions, judgments, all quietly issued beneath the surface of our interactions. And now she looked at me differently. Not with affection or even resentment, but with calculation, as if unsure whether the rules she'd always relied on would still protect her, as if trying to gauge how much I had changed in the span of that one silent, decisive moment when I switched those cups and dared her to notice. She never asked again what was in the tea. She never even brought it up, which in its own way was more telling than any confession could have been, because my mother, for all her flaws, was not a coward, at least not when it came to maintaining control. The fact that she didn't confront me meant she was uncertain. And uncertainty was a new language for her, one she didn't speak fluently, one that made her tread lightly for perhaps the first time in our lives. Then, one morning, a notification lit up on my phone while I sat alone in the kitchen, sipping actual tea, plain, unspiked, peaceful. Emily had posted a new video, this time not a filtered shot of her outfit or a view of the Seine, but a close-up of her face, serious, composed, set against a pale Parisian wall. She titled it, "How Trauma Made Me Stronger," and I felt a strange mix of dread and amusement settle into my gut, because I knew before I even pressed play that she would find a way to turn the dinner into a story about her, that somehow her 10 minutes of breathless panic would evolve into a tale of resilience, of sisterly betrayal, of how she overcame a terrifying allergy attack that had left her shaken and reflective and more determined than ever to choose peace and remove toxicity from her life. She spoke directly into the camera, her voice soft, deliberate, and at times quivering, though never so much that it risked ruining her makeup. She described how she had felt herself slipping, how for a moment she believed it might be the end, how it made her reevaluate everything she thought she knew about family, about trust, about safety. And then, right before the end, she pulled out a necklace, one I had given her years ago, when we were still teenagers, during one of those rare stretches where we weren't fighting, when I still believed that one day she might look at me the way I looked at her, with admiration instead of dismissal. She held the necklace up to the camera, let the sunlight catch the charm, and then, without hesitation, dropped it into the Seine behind her. I watched it sink beneath the gray water, watched her face stay composed as she whispered, "I'm done holding on to things that don't serve me anymore." And for the first time, in a very long time, I felt something other than anger toward her. I felt pity. Not the condescending kind, but a deep, human kind, the realization that she truly believed she was the wounded party in a narrative she didn't even understand, that she had constructed an entire identity around being loved too much, coddled too much, and never having to see the damage she left behind. I didn't comment on the video. I didn't text her. I didn't mention it to Mom. I simply closed the app, placed my phone face down on the table, and finished my tea, savoring the warmth, the stillness, the unspoken knowledge that while she was out there trying to rewrite our story in a way that made her feel safe, I had finally stepped out of it altogether. A week later, I packed up the last of my things from the guest room, the one I had stayed in during what was meant to be a short visit, but had turned into something far more significant. I didn't leave a mess. I didn't leave a note. I didn't even say goodbye in the traditional sense. Instead, I left a small envelope on the kitchen table, addressed simply to Mom, and inside it was a single piece of paper with 8 handwritten words. "You forgot me for 41 years. Enough." I don't know how she reacted when she found it. I don't know if she cried, or if she crumpled it, or if she sat down in silence and stared at it for hours, realizing that the quiet daughter who had always been easy to overlook had finally decided to be done. Not loudly. Not destructively. Just completely. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy, but it was mine, my books on the shelves, my scent in the sheets, my voice in the silence. I painted one of the walls a deep navy blue, the color I'd always loved, but had never used in any shared space, because someone else had always had stronger opinions, louder preferences, more say. I started going to therapy, not because I was broken, but because I was finally ready to see what was left after all the survival had been stripped away. I joined a support group for adult daughters of narcissistic parents, and during the first meeting, when it came my turn to speak, I introduced myself by saying, "Hi, I'm Lisa. I used to think being the strong one was a compliment. Now I think it's a cage." And somewhere along the way, I realized that what I had done that night with the tea wasn't about vengeance. Not really. It was about disruption. It was about forcing a pause in a narrative that had always cast me as background noise, about creating a moment so undeniable, so jarring, that they had no choice but to notice me, even if they still didn't understand. Even if they twisted the story into something else. Because once the truth is out there, even in fragments, it lingers. It stains. It reshapes. A few months after I left, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was brief, unsigned. We were never the same after that night. But I guess that was the point. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because the truth is, not all revenge is about punishment. Sometimes, it's about resurrection. It's about waking yourself up from a life you didn't choose and walking away, even if your hands are shaking, even if no one claps, even if you're the only one who knows it was a victory. And as for the tea, I don't think they'll ever drink it the same way again.